Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, sir. I hope you're doing well. So as it appears, my project is about the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq, uh, or as I like to describe it, it is the most catastrophic and unnecessary wars in the modern history. So, first, we're going to talk about the 9/11 attacks because it's where everything started. The September 11 morning that seemed just like any usual morning in New York City until the image of the two passenger planes flying into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center has completely turned history on its head. This day, America was reeling and over 3,000 people were killed. Very soon, it became clear amongst the intelligence services that Al Qaeda was behind it, this extremist group that was mainly based in Afghanistan. The night of 9/11, an urgent memo comes in the Pentagon from the Deputy Secretary of the State to the Defense Intelligence Agency asking for information about Iraq and its relation to terrorism. The Deputy Secretary of the State at the time was Paul Wolfowitz. So a few days later, on September 15, at Camp David, Bush and his advisors were gathered to discuss destroying international terrorism, focusing on Afghanistan. Until Paul Wolfowitz and his leader, Donald Rumsfeld, pointed out that Al Qaeda would not do it all alone. They probably were helped by Saddam Hussein. Everyone actually at the meeting was surprised because they were discussing the matter of Afghanistan, Al Qaeda, and Taliban, not Iraq. So here we see how the seed of invading Iraq was planted. Later on, the first target of Afghanistan and Taliban's regime was not able to resist. Their defeat by America was inevitable. At that point, most people thought that this was the end of the American so called war on terror, but not, because the seed in Bush's mind was already blooming. After this meeting, Bush decided that he would find a way to invade Iraq. For him, Iraq was a perfect decisive target because fighting extremist group hiding in caves of Afghanistan was not an easy goal to achieve. He considered the invasion of Iraq as a restoration of his country's looted dignity, as a rebuttal to the terrible 9/11 attacks. For that, he needed a strong story, a reasonable justification for the world's public opinion. And eventually, it just went like this: Iraq is harboring terrorists, Iraq is developing nuclear weapons, Iraq is working on WMDs. Colin Powell gave his speech at the UN. He claimed that the US intelligence services provided this information for the government, but how could they get it? What were their resources? And that's what Ali Soufan elaborates in his speech. Despite the rising voices of Americans and the whole world's public opinion who rejected this war, despite the protests and the absence of the public support. Unlike the war on Afghanistan, there was no unanimous support for the war on Iraq. Iraq was a whole different situation since the US was not attacked by Saddam, but Bush was convinced that Iraq was the good war. The US Army took his troops, invaded Iraq, they did what they did, they took down Saddam's regime, but eventually the war was no longer good. May 2003, 2 months after the invasion, Bush went on the aircraft carrier of San Diego to announce with a giant sign that says, "Mission accomplished." It was a great achievement for Bush's administration, such a moment of pride. They thought again that the war was over, but in fact, the war has just started. The US invaded Iraq because of Saddam's possession of WMDs, which turned out to be completely wrong. And the blame cannot be put on Ibn Sheikh al-Libi because he had to do so. He was obliged to admit something that was dictated to him because he was tortured. The US intelligence wanted to believe and to convince themselves and the world that this relationship between Iraq and Al Qaeda existed. Jonathan Steele, a journalist and an author of widely acclaimed studies of international relations, wrote in his book Defeat about how the US failed in planning what comes next. Bush's government had no idea about this new Iraq nor about the old one. Bush made no clear attempts to understand the complexity of the Iraqi society or the vitality of its political activities. They saw Iraq as just another transition country without a civil society or a history of democratic struggle. Perhaps the biggest mistake of not paying attention to Iraqi society by the White House is not realizing the power of Islamic movements. It looks like Bush didn't know that the Islamists were already witnessing a rise in the last decade of Saddam's regime and that they were bound to be stronger if it is to be dropped. Of course, Islamic movements oppose the dominant presence of the West in the Middle East, and this opposition represents one of the reactions, or perhaps the strongest, in the last 2 decades to the humiliation caused by the brutal Western intervention in the region. This issue should have been a warning signal had Bush taken it into account during pre-war planning. It is true that Saddam was hated by most of Iraqis by 2003, but it's funny to think that it meant that the Iraqi people would automatically welcome the invasion, treat the occupiers as editors, and be pleased that the Westerners, with their strategic projects and their long track record of intervention in the Middle East, would remain to teach him how to govern himself. The occupation was doomed to failure from the beginning, because occupation is humiliating in itself, and people prefer to run their own affairs and hate to have strangers take over their homelands. And any foreign army overthrows a system should leave the country within weeks or months after the invasion, or the suspicion will grow very quickly that the real goals of the strangers are imperial. This does not apply anywhere in the world as much as the Middle East, where feelings of dignity, honor, and sovereignty represent the currency of the daily life of its people. A Western force invading a Muslim state in the heart of the Middle East in the 21st century is a completely different story. The region has a powerful collective memory of imperial intervention and a deep sense of patriotism against the West and the threats against their Islamic identity. Of course, this is not a justification for what these types of terrorist organizations do in Iraq, but before blaming them, we should take into account that America, while pretending to fight a non-existent terrorism, it's created something worse than that.